Our next speaker is Dr. Sushma Fanse. She is MBBS MD Anesthesiology from Sion Hospital. She was clinical assistant at AIPMR in 2006. She was a trainee observer in pain fellowship program at New York Wyckoff Hospital for 3 months. She is a practicing pain physician and interventionalist since 15 years. She has initiated establishment of pain clinics at LTMMC and LTMGH Sion, Hindu Mahasabha Hospital, Ghatkopar, and Holy Spirit Hospital, Andheri. She is consultant pain specialist at Parak Hospital, Ghatkopar. She is visiting pain consultant at Hindu Sabha Hospital, Ghatkopar, and visiting pain consultant at LTMMC and Sion Hospital.
It's really nice to be back here after so many years. As you all know that I was working here as an assistant many years ago, 15 years ago, and I learned with Dr. Lakshmi Vas. She's been my guru, mentor since then, not only when I was here, but even till today. And I think all of you should congratulate yourselves, because this is a very unique opportunity, and such a workshop you'll not get anywhere else. So you're really lucky for that. So that I'll start with my topic, lumbar canal stenosis. So lumbar canal stenosis is a common source of pain and diminished function amongst most of the adults with chronic low back pain. Now, I could not find any Indian statistics. I even consulted my colleague who's a spine surgeon, but there is a general consensus when you go through all the journals, there is that this is prevalence is almost 50% in individuals over 60 years of age, and is the most common indication for spinal surgery in the USA. The definition of spinal canal stenosis, it's a lumbar canal stenosis. It's a narrowing or stricture of the lumbar spinal canal with potential for nerve impingement, which may occur in the central canal, in the lateral recess, or the neuroforamen. So this is a standard definition that is given in the textbooks. And it is also said that the canal stenosis refers to a diverse set of conditions, which is actually it's a normal aging process which occurs in all of us. And so it is not a disease according to the latest, the references which I went through. They just describe it as a series of conditions which lead to the degeneration. So it's supposed to occur in response to insults like mechanical or metabolic injury, and it's a degenerative change rather than a disease. Now, the anatomy of the spine, we all have covered it up yesterday, and even today Madhvi and Madam have described the basic functional unit. So the vertebral column, we can see that 70% of the weight is borne by the anterior portion, and the 30% is on by the posterior portion. What are the functions of the spine? It has 3 functions: to provide structural support, enable trunk movement, and protect the neural elements. So a functional spine unit is typically described as 2 adjacent vertebrae, the intervertebral disc, the spinal ligaments, and facet joints between them. Now, the etiology of lumbar canal stenosis is congenital and acquired. Now, congenital is idiopathic and achondroplastic. So I'm not going to dwell much on that, because majority of the cases that will come to you are of the degenerative type, which is the most common. Then sometimes you have congenital and degenerative, as in spondylolisthetic, spondylitic. Then there is inflammatory spondyloarthritis, like some conditions like you may get it in ankylosing spondylitis and other autoimmune conditions. Then you have post-traumatic, like fractures and FBS, failed back surgery syndrome, which I think subsequently you'll have a talk on that. metabolic Paget's disease, fibrosis, and tumors, and lastly infection. So I am going to talk mainly about the degenerative spine, and it's a very, it's like an umbrella term, you know, it encompasses the whole continuum of changes that occur in the spine as a result of aging, wear and tear. Now all the details, I mean, we have gone through most of it in our previous lectures, I think, the changes that occur. So, but I will just go through part by part and we'll see the sequence as the changes occur. Before that, there is an anatomical classification which is like central canal, lateral canal and foraminal. Now what is central canal is the area between the facet joints with the dura mater and its contents. You can see in the diagram. Lateral canal stenosis is the lateral border of the dura to the medial part of the pedicle. It contains the exiting nerve root under the superior articular process. The foraminal stenosis occurs in the region which is anterior to the pars. It contains the dorsal root ganglion and the ventral root. Now in the lower ventral segments, I mean lumbar segments, you can find the dorsal root ganglion typically in this region, but as you go up towards L1, L2, sometimes it is more towards the center. Extraforaminal stenosis is the exit zone, that is, it is a far lateral stenosis. It is lateral to the facet joint. The nerve root is present in this location. So we'll go through all that in the subsequent slides. Now you have to remember that the four main parts where the changes occur is, one is the vertebral bodies, disc, facet joints and ligaments. So why should you know? So once you know where it has occurred, you know exactly what you have to treat, and secondly you also know the progress of the disease. How much is it? How much has it progressed? So we'll talk about it more in detail. Now changes are starting from the disc, because the whole process starts in the nucleus pulposus. I think I will just go very fast through this because it's going to be a repetition. The changes start in the nucleus pulposus. They progress to circumferential, then radial tears. Then there is a disc bulge, protrusion, extrusion and sequestration. So these are the changes, as Madam has said, that the annulus fibrosus gives way, it loosens and then the nucleus bulges out. Now there are so many confusing terms, spondylosis, spondylitis and listhesis, all those will be subsequently clear. But spondylosis is what Madam described in her lecture. The end plate changes, the changes occur in the end plates and the marrow involvement, the modic changes which occur in the bone marrow. So these are the advanced stenosis. Now the nucleus pulposus material can go into the body of the vertebra, which is known as Schmall's nodes. We saw Scheuermann's disease. All that has been covered up. Okay. So there is a degenerative cascade. What starts first? It starts in the nucleus pulposus. It progresses to degeneration of the disc with the separation of the end plates. So this is acute, subacute. It presents as acute, subacute or non-specific pain. Then there is early progression where there is progressive end plate separation, weakening, further weakening of the annulus, radial tears in the disc, and then migration of the nucleus posteriorly. So here you have to remember that the nucleus migrates posteriorly because that is the weakest part of the capsule. And there is herniation, then further there is also involvement of facet joint. Now here you can see that the changes in the facet joint have already started. I don't know whether you can see my cursor there. Okay, so then the next stage is where it starts progressing up and down and involves the upper and the lower vertebrae. So this is the further is the instability phase of degeneration. There's further disc narrowing here, and there will be end plate changes, then there will be facet osteoarthritis with bony spurs formation leading to foraminal stenosis, and also ligamentum flavum hypertrophy. Now with this instability, what happens is the vertebra tends to lose its alignment, and if it is unstable, it changes with movement. So with further progress, this becomes fixed, where there is a lot of degeneration, where the disc is completely fibrosed and it is shrunk, the vertebra height is less. In that it remains, sometimes it remains fixed, central and foraminal stenosis. So these are the changes which start in the nucleus pulposus, and this figure shows how it progresses. The facet joints. Now we'll consider the facet joints. What happens in the facets? They are basically synovial joints, and the first reaction that occurs is synovitis. Now the synovitis reflects, as madam said, that the synovitis reflects in so many changes in the surrounding structures, including the muscle, that we'll come to later. But what happens is there is a joint hypertrophy secondary to degenerative disc disease. There is inflammation, formation of cysts, loosening of the joint capsule, and formation of osteophytes. And on the superior articular process, whatever osteophytes happen, they narrow the lateral recess, and on the inferior articular process, they narrow the central canal. So here you can see in this picture the pictures. There's a facetal arthropathy happening here, and this is a picture of a synovial cyst. Then changes even occur in the ligamentum flavum. There is a degeneration, and the herniation of the disc finally leads to a ligamentum flavum hypertrophy. Now why? Because it's a thick ligament, and it ensures as I said, the joint becomes unstable. So this hypertrophy is as a response to make it more stable. This will further reduce as you see in this MRI picture, that there is a further decrease in the canal, the central canal, and leading to central canal stenosis. Now they have classified the central canal stenosis into grades. Grade 0 is the normal one. In grade 1, the anterior CSF space is mildly obliterated. Nerves of cauda equina are still separately seen. So you can see in this second picture that you can make out these are the nerves of the cauda equina. Then in grade 2, they are clumped together, and in grade 3, they just appear as a bundle here. So these are the 4 stages. In lateral canal, similarly, you have three stages. Grade 0 is normal. In grade 1, you have narrowing of the lateral recess, but there is no flattening of the nerve, because a lot of the fat is still preserved there. Then there is a further narrowing in grade 2. You find there is a narrowing with a slight flattening of the nerve, and in grade 3 there is severe narrowing and complete obliteration of the CSF space, which is there lateral to the root here. Compare this and this, you can see that. Then foraminal stenosis, grade 0 is of course normal. Now the foramen, it has a normal teardrop appearance. In that first picture you can make out this is a normal foramen. Then there is deformity of the epidural fat, but the nerve root is still surrounded by some fat. Then as in moderate stenosis, there's a marked stenosis with nerve root only partially surrounded by the fat. And in this you cannot make out the anatomy of the foramen at all, because there's a complete obliteration of the epidural fat with surrounding the nerve. Okay. Then there is extra foraminal stenosis. Now this is, in some books they describe it as that, but many textbooks just say central, lateral and foraminal. But this is important because when we talk of listhesis, we will have in the lecture, it is a far lateral kind of, where the nerve root is out of the foramen and there it is getting compressed. So it is lateral to the facet joint. And so sometimes if there's a far lateral disc, a disc which is protruding very laterally out and compressing, that causes this extraforaminal stenosis. And in listhesis, where you see the subluxation of the vertebra over one over the other, there is a compression of the obliteration of the foramen, and there is a compression of the nerve here. And of course, facet arthritis. Facet arthritis can also lead to changes where the nerve actually exits out, and as we saw in the previous slide. So very severe arthritis of the facet joint can also give rise to extraforaminal stenosis. Now we discussed all these factors, the different parts of the what you call as a functional unit. We discussed about changes in the, first we started with the nucleus pulposus, and the vertebra, then the disc, the facets, the vertebrae, the ligaments. So all this, what is the final outcome of all this degeneration is a canal stenosis. That means there is a narrowing of some pressure on the nerve root. Then because of that, there is stretch, attrition, compression, and that affects the blood supply to the nerve, the nutrition, and there is ischemia. So these changes are called neuropathy. So any pain which is caused by damage to the nerve, it could be any kind of damage. It could be a mechanical damage. It can be a ischemic damage. Of course, one leads to the other. You can't say that it's just one or the other one. All these are called neuropathies, and neuropathic pain is different from the nociceptive pain, as you all know, because it has its own identifying elements. So then this leads to peripheral and central sensitization. Now, are you all familiar with all this sensitization? Because it's a different topic. So in general, all these sensitization changes occur, leading to what we call as a neuropathic pain. And we'll see in a further slides how the patient presents clinically. But now, logically speaking, if you address this neuropathy, are we going to get pain relief? It doesn't happen. Clearly, in practice, you find that if you remove the main constricting factor, whatever is affecting the nerve, suppose you free the nerve by any means, still patient is not completely pain-free. So this equation is incomplete. It's not, there is something missing here. So now, what is the missing link? By now, I think all of you know what the missing link is. Muscles. Yeah. So in any standard textbook, if you go, they will give you causes of canal stenosis, neuropathy, this, that, but nobody will mention muscles, as madam has said. So muscles are the missing link, and logically so, because they are occupying such a big portion of they are so adjacent to the vertebral column, and so many small muscles, you must have realized, muscles we never even know about. There are so many small muscles which are taking part in our daily movement and stabilization of the spine. So the erector muscles, which extend right from the capitals to the sacrum. Yesterday she told us they're serial. So where one ends, the other starts. So they are the main things that support the spine. There's quadratus lumborum, psoas, which is spine flexor, which is so important because even in sitting, all these psoas is supporting the spine. So yesterday it was madam, if you remember, explained that if there is a spasm in the psoas, the nerve exiting root can get pinched between the psoas and the intertransversalis because there's so much in close connection. So it's a very important muscle. And then there are deeper muscles like the multifidi, the intertransversi, and the interspinalis. So these muscles also, they are small muscles and they support the spine, the segmental movement which occurs in the spine, and that they are very important. Now in any kind of neuropathy you go in the body, it's not only in this is one example of a neuropathic pain. Every neuropathic pain has a common denominator, which is the muscle. So now what muscles we have, I think, by now you know all the muscles which can be involved. The dorsal rami, now here in this diagram you can see that there is, the dorsal rami will supply the, this is iliocostalis, longissimus, multifidus, all this. The ventral ramus goes ahead and it supplies the quadratus lumborum, okay, and psoas. So, and of course the sciatic nerve and the femoral nerve. The femoral nerve comes from L2, 3, 4 as we all know, and it supplies the muscles of the these quadriceps and the anterior lateral part of the leg, and your sciatic nerve also supplies all the main muscles of the thigh and the calf. Now all these muscles have some connection obviously with the lumbar plexus. So all these muscles are going to be involved. Now there are some dermatomyotomes which they said. Now all these areas which sort of give you referred pain as shown in this diagram, the muscles are also, the pain is mediated by the small muscles which are present in those dermatomes, which was just, I think madam talked about it in the previous lecture. So what exactly happens now when the nerve and the muscle connect? There are some events which occur in neuropathy. What is the events? There is an excessive acetylcholine release with a contracted sarcomere, and because the muscle is constantly, it kind of fibrillates all the time, so there is an increased energy demand. So this is known as the energy crisis, okay, and there are formation of hot spots which are called trigger points, which were introduced by madam in the last lecture. So they have a distinct what is this trigger point? It's a hot spot in the sense there is a huge lot of concentrated inflammatory substances which are secreted, cytokines, interleukins, and phospholipase A, which is most important. So all these are secreted at the irritated motor nerve terminal. Now they occur in, as we have already seen why they would occur in the lumbar canal stenosis, because of the altered mechanics and the trophic factors which are released. Then referred pain is due to the central sensitization of the dorsal horn. So the dorsal horn gets centrally sensitized, and alpha and beta adrenergic receptors at the end plate, they induce the autonomic changes. So in many times when you see a patient of a canal stenosis, you might find there is a swelling of the foot. Sometimes there is loss of hair. The skin looks very shiny. In very chronic patients, you will see the changes occurring in the skin also, nails, and the temperature also. So adrenaline, there's further adrenaline, this adrenaline released in these adrenergic receptors sites also contributes further to the energy crisis. As we said, adrenaline is that flight fright hormone. So involuntarily also it causes the muscles to tighten up. So at a trigger point, you can imagine there are already so many chemicals which are acting on that, which are causing the changes of sensitization at the nerve terminal, and to add to it there is also further adrenaline. So here I want to mention about actually the slide should have come before. The multifidus is, I have specially kept this because I read a paper where they have studied multifidus and they did electromyography on multifidus and all the muscles in the back, the muscles that we discussed in patients of back pain, and they found that there were increased fibrillatory activity, especially in the multifidus and the psoas. Now this multifidus, as you can see, it goes in a superomedial fashion, it goes from the transverse process to the spinous process. So it goes to 3-4 vertebrae above. So it is supplied by the medial branch of the posterior ramus, which we saw, and it goes under the mammulo-accessory ligament. So this nerve almost always gets stretched in any back pain, and so the multifidus is one muscle that you must always needle whenever you're looking at canal stenosis. So they did studies and they found that initially there was increased activity, and then it was followed by fatty infiltration, which you can see here. The second slide, there is fatty infiltration occurring in grade 1 and grade 2. With the last slide, you can hardly see the muscle. And there is a decrease in the radiographic density. So these changes mainly they found in the multifidus and psoas. So they also found, yeah, you can compare those. They also found, pardon?
Can you please put pointers on the
See, this is your, here the fatty infiltration has just started. Here you can see there are few strands, and here it's all fatty infiltration. So they found also that in a case, suppose you have a patient of radiculopathy where there is a one-sided unilateral symptoms, but they found that the muscle on both sides were affected. So I think I've quoted that paper here, but I can give you the details later. So that's why you have to needle both the sides. So even in a case of radicular pain, you need to address both sides, not just one side. So we now, just going back to the earlier diagram, now we said there was a missing link. Now this is the final picture. So there is a nerve injury, there is peripheral sensitization, in the spinal receptive field organization, cortical reorganization leading to central sensitization and pain. It also activates, but this is just half the story. The other half is that activation of muscle nociceptors, formation of trigger points, and inflammatory amines and all are secreted there, and neuroplasty in the dorsal horn, which is giving rise to the increased exaggerated pain sensation. And there are different types of presentations. We'll look at it briefly in the clinical examination, but the main is the neuroplasty in the dorsal horn. Now what is different about this? The muscles they have a two-way relationship between the sensitization process. So normally what happens with the nerve, if you give a nerve block, you're actually blocking the sensitization process. But in muscles it's not true, because the sensitization causes MTP, this trigger point formation. Trigger point formation again causes sensitization. So it's like a vicious circle. So it keeps on happening, and we find that you may remove the original cause of whatever is causing this, but the muscles keep on and on, you know, it's like a unending thing. The cycle continues. So the muscle pain will keep on happening, the trigger points keep on happening. So this is important. So after removing the original painful stimulus, also the pain persists in so many neuropathic conditions. So you have pressure on the nerve root, which causes the pain. The pain causes shortening of muscles, and shortening of muscles further causes pressure on the nerve root. So it's like a vicious circle, which we have to break. Now we come to the clinical symptoms. So this is about the anatomy, the pathology we have covered. How will the patients actually come to you? They're usually above 50 years, females, common in females. They have what is called as a neurogenic claudication. Classically, they have axial pain. If they are having central stenosis, they have axial pain, weakness in the buttocks. Okay, if there's a lateral stenosis, there is a dermatomal distribution on the one side. We'll come to the differences in the subsequent slide. Then it's related to posture. There is increased, it is always increased with spine extension and prolonged walking and standing. So because we saw that when there is a herniation of or a bulge, it is mainly in the posterior part. So when the patient bends forward, there is a little less pressure in the canal. So this is a body's mechanism to reduce the pain. And the history, they say typically they say they feel like they're walking on cotton wool. You know, they don't get that feeling of even if they walk on the floor, they don't. They say that they're walking on cotton wool, but sometimes they even complain of burning sensation. See, that symptoms can vary. There is relief on flexion and sitting. In severe cases, of course, you get whether the full cauda equina involvement, you may get rest pain or even neurogenic bladder. So the signs. Now the signs are a stooped gait. This is called a shopping cart sign, and it's called a simian stance. You know, where the patient typically stands with the flexed spine. And this shopping cart sign is classical for a central canal stenosis. But sometimes what happens is, if there is a lateral disc, say, and there is a neuropathy in the L5S1, the patient comes with foot drop. Now, if a patient has a foot drop, he will have a steppage gait, you know. So there is excessive circumflexion of the affected side, and the patient puts the foot on the toes rather than the heel. So though the books describe this typical gait, you may have variations, because normally what happens is these patients are old and they have associated knee problem, hip problem. So accordingly, you will find a difference in the gaits. So heel walk will be, if there is pain, it suggests L4-5. Toe walk pain suggests S1. There is restricted extension, as we said, because they are always it's very painful for them to extend the spine. The straight leg raising is reduced more in lateral stenosis. There is hamstring stiffness. Now, this is what the patient normally complains, you know. They will not tell you that they have trigger points, but they will always say, very stiff, payat gole yetat. This is a very common symptom, and that is because of the hamstring stiffness. The single column loading test. Now, this test, if there is a lateral disc, suppose it's pressing on the lateral side, the patient will not be able to support the weight on the affected side. Sometimes you will find the pelvis drooping to the opposite side. You know what this is classically? This happens if there is a gluteus medius weakness, then the pelvis also droops to the other side. So it's called a Trendelenburg sign. So you can have different pictures in this, though they describe this typically. In a typical case, all this happens, but in clinical practice, you can't expect to get a pure case of canal stenosis. You should look for, because normally when patients come, at least I have seen in my practice, they usually have some knee problem, knee pain or hip pain, you know, old age, so they have arthritis issues. So if a patient comes to you for knee pain, it's not that you just examine the knee. You have to examine the spine in all cases, because these two are different issues and they can exist together. And because these are different issues, your clinical presentation will also be a mixed picture. It can't be just for, you know, a typical picture. Then the reflexes are usually normal. Now sensations, I told you that it can range from hypoalgesia to allodynia. Now I don't know if you all are familiar with all those terms, so I don't go. Yeah. And then there are trophic skin changes, as we discussed earlier, because of the autonomic nerves involved. Now the motor examination. So as I said, they only have this muscle stiffness, payat gole, this is their symptom. You will see, sometimes you see this taut ropey bands, you know, on inspection. And if you palpate, you can see that ropey, you know, the skin, the tendon slips under your fingers, so you can make out. And there will be tender spots in the muscle, which are palpable. And sometimes when you press on the, at that painful spot, you will get a referral of pain. Now they have done studies and they have found that this trigger point, if formed in one muscle, it can be formed even in a site away from the muscle, or there may be latent trigger points very far away from the affected muscle. So you have to look for that. Sometimes the pain may not be referred, it may be just locally painful. There is a painful limit to the full range of motion always. because even the straight leg raise, they will get pain immediately, you know, after 30 degrees, 40 degrees, depending on how severe the compression is. There is a restricted range of motion, decreased power and reflexes. Now this depends on how much is the severity of the compression. Surprisingly, in many times you see, and it will be discussed further, that that many patients are totally asymptomatic. That is what we find in the, means they have a stenosis but they don't have symptoms which are concordant with the amount of stenosis. In sensory examination they are absolutely normal, there is no problem, but depending on the severity they will say either tingling numbness, you know, mungya yetat, or झिंझिण्या yetat, you know, paresthesia, or they will say that it is more pronounced when they walk or whatever, so when the pressure increases. Sometimes they have hypoalgesia, hypoesthesia, or sometimes totally analgesia, or they can have hyperesthesia, hyperalgesia, or allodynia. So as madam described, you know, they have that sensation of something crawling on their feet, you know, so all those, or there's something ants biting, or you know, burning. All these sensations, different kind of sensations can happen. Now this is a difference between the central and the lateral canal stenosis, which I have just enumerated. In central canal there is axial pain with non-dermatomal distribution. Usually both the thighs and buttocks are involved. In lateral canal it's a radicular pain in specific dermatomal pattern. So the L5S1 is affected, you will get that dermatome, the pain radiating along the dermat. Feeling of walking of cotton wool here. Here they may be more common in lateral canal. You will find lancinating, burning, shock-like pain. As an electric shock geल्यासारखं, so they say, you know. There are symptoms of pseudo-claudication. Urogenic claudication means when they walk, they cannot walk for a long time, they cannot stand. Whereas this doesn't happen, neurogenic claudication doesn't happen here. So there is a, typically they have this bicycle test. You know, the picture is sometimes confusing whether it's a vascular or a, I have discussed it later, so I think I'll skip it for now. So in this there is a shopping cart sign. Here there is a steppage gait if there is a radiculopathy. Okay, sometimes if there is more of a knee involvement, you may even get an antalgic gait. So depending, so gait is classically, you cannot say that it is always a shopping cart sign. You may get a mixed picture. The pain is relieved in central canal by stooping, sitting or resting. These lateral canal stenosis, they have pain at rest, at night, and with the Valsalva maneuver. These the central canal stenosis, they cannot walk for more than a few steps. These people have a higher walking tolerance, and the central canal stenosis normally occurs in about patients over 65 years. These patients are a little younger, around 40 years. Now there is a lot of variability of presentation. There is no correlation between the severity of symptoms and the severity of the stenosis. Sometimes, and this is very commonly seen in practice. You look at the patient's MRI, oh my God, it's typically you will see that, we'll see that in investigations, the hourglass appearance and all the facet changes. But he's comfortable, he is in pain, but it's tolerable pain, you know. But sometimes there is nothing much seen, but patient complains of very bad pain and very upset. So they are, it all depends on the age and the lifestyle. If a person is used to hard work, working in the field, they normally have a higher pain tolerance than the city person. And of course, presence of comorbidities. These patients are also, all the geriatric problems have to be taken into account when you treat anything, because they may have diabetes, very common. They may have some other peripheral neuropathies. So you have to be on the lookout for them. And the pain tolerance of each patient is different. So now the differential diagnosis is, first is mechanical low back pain, which madam has discussed in detail. Then there is cauda equina syndrome, where patient has a neurogenic bladder and completely he has lost sensations in the perineal area. Then there is vascular pain. Now this is something very common. You see, it's confusing sometimes to know whether it's a vascular pain or it's a canal stenosis. Then there is, of course, in the next slide, so I won't elaborate now. Peripheral neuropathy. Normally in diabetes, also they have some symptoms which may be similar, but they have a history of comorbidities and glove and stocking type of hypoalgesia. Then there may be hip and knee arthropathy. As I said, these patients are old and normally they have these conditions also. Then there is, nowadays they have what is called a greater trochanteric pain syndrome, they call it. So formerly what they used to call as trochanteric bursitis is now there are lot of conditions which they have kind of clubbed, because we saw in the anatomy that the greater trochanter is a very busy place. So there are bursae around it, there is a lot of tendinous attachments. So if there is this greater trochanteric pain syndrome, is where specifically there is a gluteus medius tendinopathy. So this can happen even in a spinal stenosis, so it can happen. So this and piriformis syndrome, they are both conditions which can exist independently, or you can get it as a result of the stenosis. And piriformis, as we have seen, that there is a pincer effect between the piriformis and Then sometimes in young patients you get an acute central disc herniation. If they do some gym activity or they fall, they have some fracture or something, this can acutely prolapse. But they have similar symptoms, but they don't have a canal stenosis like what we classically describe as. So these people will have pain on sitting. Normally when you get a patient of canal stenosis, they have relief on sitting. These people are not comfortable on sitting and they have very positive sciatic stretch tests. So what is the difference between the neurogenic and the vascular? So the location of pain in neurogenic is usually in the thighs, calves, back, and rarely buttocks. In vascular it is mainly buttocks and the calves. Quality of pain is burning, cramping. In vascular it is cramping. The aggravating factors are ambulation, erect posture, extension of the spine. And vascular claudication is any leg exercise. So there is one bicycle test which is normally done where the patient is asked to cycle, on a stationary cycle. After these patients with the neurogenic claudication are very comfortable. They will do the cycling because the posture is very convenient. But in vascular claudication, they will start getting the pain immediately. Then leg pulses are normal in neurogenic. In vascular claudication, there is hypotension, decreased or absent pulses, and there may be a murmur present. Skin trophic changes are absent in neurogenic, but they are more present in the vascular because of the ischemic changes. Autonomic changes, unless it is very, very severe, it is rare, but here impotence can exist with other symptoms. Now the investigations in the canal stenosis. X-rays will give you the alignment they will give you a general picture of decreased space in the height of the vertebra and all that. But if the most confirmatory, and of course X-rays will also show you a listhesis where there is a subluxation of the vertebrae, but the most definitive thing is the MRI. It is most important to confirm the diagnosis in symptomatic patients, and you have to do it if you are planning any investigation or any intervention. Now CT scan, you may have to advise if they have some pacemaker or some implants, that they are not suitable for MRI. Myelography, EMG and nerve conduction study is normally it's a very painful thing, and normally you don't need to do it, but many times you see people, I don't know, they just advise. Surgeons, they advise it. Doppler studies are done. If you are suspecting a vascular claudication, you must do Doppler. Now there are red flags. Now if a patient comes to you, you should also know when you are not going to handle the patient. And so if there's a cauda equina syndrome with incontinence and all that, spinal vascular malformations, malignancy, if the patient says I have lost weight, he has history of intractable pains, which are, or a progressive kind of a neuropathy, you know, which he is not able to tolerate. There's history of fever, localized tenderness, okay, high counts, then you will always at least investigate more, in detail, and if necessary, refer the patient. Now, treatment options, surgery, there is surgery and there is non-surgery. So, there is a general consensus in many of the reviews that I went through that non-surgical treatment is the first step in a canal stenosis. So there is pharmacotherapy and there are interventions like US guided, like dry needling, this trigger point injections, nerve blocks, epidural steroids, RF ablations. Then there is RAX catheter, in failed back surgery syndromes, and there is spinal cord stimulator, peripheral nerve stimulator. All these are these advanced percutaneous decompression. And then there is physical therapy and treatment of comorbidities. But now surgery is indicated only for, we have seen now when to refer the patient. It is for severe pain, constant symptoms, neurological symptoms, or in failure of all this. It can be open, minimally invasive. So they do decompression by laminectomy with or without facetectomy. Okay, and interlaminar decompression with excision of thickened ligamentum flavum, facet capsule, and hypertrophied facet. Or there is instrumented fusion done in severe foraminal stenosis if there is an unstable listhesis and recurrent stenosis. So nowadays they also do microsurgery to reduce the mortality and morbidity. Pharmacotherapy, the first line is usually you give NSAIDs or muscle relaxants. Now muscle relaxants, if you are doing dry needling, they have no role to play actually. Second line is tramadol, Ultracet, neuromodulators. See, drugs are, it's not that you should not use any medications, you have to use the medications initially to, kickstart when you're putting the patient on whatever therapy, whatever treatment, and then slowly taper the drugs. So the aim is to taper the drugs and as much as possible. Now opioid, I very rarely use opioids. They use them left and right in the West. But opioids only once or twice if the patient comes and they are really in severe pain before you even start anything. If they are too in severe agony, then you put either you can put a patch, fentanyl patch, or something like buprenorphine patch. But otherwise there is no role for opioids. Then SSNRIs like duloxetine is used by some people, and sedatives. Epidural steroid injections are usually in combination with local anesthetic. Now there was a talk about whether only local anesthetic or with steroids. There is some study done. They are helpful in severe radicular symptoms and also in axial pains. So even in an axial pain, you can give them at multiple levels to kickstart the relief. So you can give it, pardon?
No, carry on.
Interlaminar, transforaminal routes, and caudal epidural. So there are 3 routes basically by which you can give. Contraindications are absolute contraindications are anticoagulant use. Just tell them this. Anticoagulant usage or coagulopathy, local or systemic infection, uncontrolled diabetes, and malignancy. These are the absolute contraindications. The relative contraindications are history of allergy, pregnancy, congestive heart failure, and failed steroid injection in the past. Now, as far as anticoagulant, nowadays they say that in the presence of Disprin, you need not discontinue. Said something. Now I'm just going to skip this slide because it's been discussed in detail. Even the spinal cord stimulation is like a panacea in the West for anything that which is hard to treat, they put a spinal cord stimulator. But it's a very expensive treatment, and I have no experience. Now there is this Manchikanti's article. I've just made a slide here to show the level of evidence. Now that level of evidence is very good for disc herniation radiculitis for the TFE, interlaminar and caudal epidural. So this is very important for us. So these are very good. And axial discogenic pain, it is a fair evidence. But sometimes caudals work very well in patients who have an axial pain and a central canal stenosis. Now, post-surgery syndrome, caudally, the level of evidence is fair. And advanced interventions, I just went through all of them. They are limited to fair, or sometimes they, even this percutaneous adhesiolysis, all this has been stopped. That's what Madhvi was saying, they have no good evidence for that. So finally, what we have seen that muscles need to be addressed. So these are all the interventions which we use for addressing the nerve compression and nerve entrapment. But finally, what you need is dry needling to have those minor entrapments which occur in the body, which are not even recognized. Now, how does dry needling act? It causes disruption of the cell membrane and causes a high amplitude. When you put a needle, there is a high discharge followed by, sometimes you see it as a twitch. It's called a localized twitch reaction followed by a relaxation. Now, if you are classically in a very active trigger point, you may see it. You can even see it as a hypoechoic spot, sometimes on the, but I haven't been I haven't seen the hypoechoic spots. I have not been able to appreciate. And what does dry needling do? It reduces the sensitization cycle.
I have given a detailed talk.
So I can just skip. And of course, there is a release of all these vasoactive substances. Now, what is the advantage? There is a sustained pain relief. Now, you can use it alone or with other things. But I have used it alone or with others, but I have always used it. So it gives a sustained pain relief, even if you have achieved, say, a good pain relief by an epidural. So many times patients come, they are very happy after the epidural, but then they come back again within a month or a few days because the pain doesn't go, because the muscles, as we saw, they continue to fire. Then there was a DBS study which was conducted by the American Journal of American Geriatric Society. They constantly update their reviews. They have found that as far as possible, we should avoid even NSAIDs in the older age group, geriatric group, because I had a couple of patients. One patient she was just taking paracetamol, but she thought it's very safe, but then she went to acute kidney failure. And wherever you can, this dry needling will reduce the dosage of other drugs. So it's a very important thing. Very safe, it's precise now with the ultrasound, it's economical also. And you have to couple it with graded exercises so that it hastens the recovery. Now, choice of protocol. Now, a patient-centered approach.
Longer, Sushma. I think we are running very much.
Okay, so just this slide. So you have to take into account the patient's concerns, like what is his expectation, and together with the patient you have to streamline your treatment. It's not like some patients, they don't want surgery. So even if it is indicated by surgeons, if the surgeon tells them they go for surgery, they don't want. So you have to, this is the first thing, that the patient satisfaction is the first thing. And you have to individualize the treatment, because expectations of treatment, it is important to tell the patient that I cannot completely cure you, but I can definitely stop the process of this stenosis and whatever is happening. So this is this is an algorithm. Probably, you can go through it later. When you get a patient, first you have to rule out the red flags. Then if you have ruled out the red flags first, you just if you have ruled, if there are red flags, definitely you'll go for advanced imaging. If there are no red flags, if there's a mild to moderate pain, then you start with dry needling and first line. Continue the treatment for 2 weeks, and if there is relief, you don't have to do even MRI. You don't directly tell the patient go for MRI. If the patient has no neurological symptoms, if the dry needling works, then no need of MRI. If the patient continues to get pain in spite of your primary, then you do the MRI, and then you can think of the other things. Suppose in spite of doing everything, if the patient's symptoms continue more in the leg, then you may have to think of a progressive neurological deficit. Otherwise, you can continue with the dry needling. So, it's summary is that it's a degenerative process. Symptoms vary very widely in practice. In absence of neurological deficits and red flags, primary treatment is non-surgical always. You have to do a multi-regime therapy, multimodal therapy regime with coexisting morbidities, and you have to treat the coexisting morbidities, and it's a major constant component. The dry needling, at least I have in my practice, as I've learned from Madam, it's always a major component of my therapy regime. And the end point is always a return to activity. Now, these are just pictures. This lady who was with completely bent posture after dry needling, she has this erect posture. I am not showing you the video. Only this. Can I play this video? So this was how he was walking. He is a case of canal stenosis at L4-5. He had more of radicular pain on one side, but he had a central pain also.
Thank you, madam. So we will move to question answer sessions. Question from Vasudha Jadhav, madam. Any specific area of muscle where dry needling is done, like near origin or insertion?
See, normally we do it at multiple points along the muscle, whichever muscle you want to needle, along the whole muscle at multiple points. It's not just necessarily done at the origin, because many times the origin or the insertion may not be accessible, and it may be tendinous, so you have to do it in the belly of the muscle.
Next question. For supraorbital neuralgia, can we do dry needling?
I do that for sure. Supraorbital, yes, of course you can.
Yeah, but I don't think we'll go into this question now because it is not related to the back. We are running short of time. Later, if we have time, we'll discuss this.
Another question from Mary Abraham, ma'am. What is the role of steroid injections during the current pandemic? Is it safe to give it to patients who have COVID or who would need vaccination?
See, you have to avoid steroids, of course, in this period of pandemic, but it depends. Now you have to see how much pain is there. You have to examine the patient. If the patient is really in very severe pain and you can give a small dose of steroid. I don't think that should be harmful. If you can just get away with steroid and just do dry needling, there's nothing like it.
See, this has been discussed a lot about this. The steroid itself is contradictory. Rheumatoid patients have to continue with steroids, and they say in these patients up to 30 milligram per day. We are giving one shot of 50 milligrams. That's it. So I feel that it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But the patient is the one who's taking the risk. So you can tell them the guidelines that it can cause immunosuppression. But having said that, there are patients with respiratory cripples, because of other problems than COVID, who continue on steroids, rheumatoid patients who continue on steroids, and the upper limit for them is about 30 to 40 milligrams per day. So, and what we give is a single shot up to 50 or 60. So we can make it 40 or 50 and give them. Discuss this with the patient. If they are ready to take the risk, it is their risk to take. It's not your risk to take.